So consider this. 3 tracks forming a perfect storm to create a myth which has become law today. The first trajectory is empirically based, evidence-based medicine. Number 2 is opinion-based medicine. And number 3 is public law and policy. Okay? So I'm going to begin in 1968. We were very concerned with rear-end collisions and the whiplashing that would occur as a result of the impact from behind. So Ayub Omaya, God rest his soul, we just lost him recently, not too long ago, performed an experiment using rhesus macaques as models to determine the forces necessary to produce damage in the neck and the brain. Very controlled experiment published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This is in 1968. He discovered that you required 40,000 radians per second squared to create damage in the neck and particularly subdural hematomas in the rhesus model. He did the normal scaling, engineering scaling, to determine that you need 7,000 radians per second squared to do damage in the human. Of course, you're not going to go experiment on a human. And if you interpolate for the baby, F equals ma, right? So you have these 2 extremes. So interpolating now, you need 11,000 radians per second squared to create a subdural, to create damage in the infant. Remember that number, please. 11,000 radians per second squared. 3 years later, 1971, an investigator named Guthkelch speculated, didn't even present a formal scientific hypothesis, but said, in so many words, I wonder if you shook a baby hard enough, could you create a subdural hematoma, a bruise under the meninges that protect the brain? Less than a year later, another another MD named Caffey, who was a radiologist, answered the question with no evidence whatsoever. He said, oh, absolutely you can do that. And this is called shaken baby syndrome. Within a year, he published another paper, again with 0 evidence whatsoever, and said, not only is that a fact, I know because I'm an MD, although I've never observed anyone shaking anyone, he said, this is a family disorder. This is not just a bad parent, this is a family disorder. And 1 year later, published yet another study in which he cited no data whatsoever and promoted this family disorder to a pandemic. The world was beset by shaking babies, and he blamed it on everything from subdural hematomas to mental retardation. We were shaking our babies. Okay, the perfect storm is brewing. So the first that I gave you was evidence-based medicine, the study by Omaya, which said 11,000 radians per second squared. You're remembering the number, good. The next 4 were opinion-based medicine. No evidence, no experiments, and we're subject today to what I call the lure of mechanism. That is, you'll hear medicine in particular say, well, here's what's happening with shaken baby syndrome. When you shake the baby, they then talk about bridging veins, and they talk about the retina and so forth, that the retina also experiences bleeding. I'm going to come back to all that because that is simply seduction to the lure of the mechanism. Because you can't do experiments with the baby itself, the phenomenon, you reduce the microscope 1 level and talk about a put together, reasonable, very reasonable set of physiology that you think now explains the phenomenon in the first place. That is a lure, it is a seduction. Perfect storm brewing. Walter Mondale wanted to be president of the United States. Now, of course, these were the old days that most of us will remember when, you know, a legislator was going to run for Congress. He had to actually have something accomplished in Congress and have something named after him, and he did. It was the Mondale Act, otherwise known as the Child Abuse and Protection and Treatment Act. Very well intended. This is a federal law level, and the idea was to protect children. Who could argue with that? The unintended consequence was that it would lead to what is now called mandatory reporting. That is, if you are a licensed healthcare provider and you're examining a child, you see anything consistent with child abuse, you are duty-bound to input it into the system. And this has devolved to the states now. Every state has a Child Protective Services, as it should. The problem is, if you don't enter, you are vulnerable downstream to legal reprisals for overlooking child abuse. If you do report it, you're forever protected, right? So what is your incentive? If you see anything consistent, you put it in. It's worse, however. I'm going to clarify this, but my tertiary research says that in some states, the more child abuse you report, the more money you get from the Mondale Act. So the whole incentive is to find child abuse. And if in doubt, you put it in, and that protects you. So at the individual level, you can see the incentive. Now, official doctrine from the American Pediatrics Association, if I get the name correct, is something like the following. Because of the increase in child abuse, by the way, if you look at the scientific literature, child abuse is actually going down not up. But because of the increase, if you see a damage on a child, in particular they're talking about subdural hematoma, if the child is less than 1 year old, you should assume that it is child abuse. So in other words, this is a professional organization saying, let's reverse from a medical viewpoint the presumption of innocence and become officers of the law and make a judgment that child abuse, which is a crime, has occurred. All right, so with that background, let me continue with now with the science. So I told you 11,000 radians per second squared was the threshold, right? So Thibault and others formed a very well done study, which we're not going to shape babies, don't worry. We're going to shape very high fidelity models which have all the articulation parts, and transportation, NASA, lots of very good research has gone into the production of these models with accelerometers appropriately on the mannequins, the models. And we're going to use Purdue University football players, and we're going to have them compete with each other and for money to shape these babies as hard as they can. We're going to record the accelerations. This happened, and the number was in evidence. It was 1,100 radians per second squared. What number did I ask you to remember? 11,000. How far are we off? By an order of magnitude, right? So this is not a rounding error. It's not something that can be made up for with a little PCP. A human being cannot get there from here, okay? This study was replicated, and the exact same number was found. It has 1,100. And by the way, the 11,000 is a conservative number. That's just for neck damage. You need more to get to the subdural. So we're being conservative scientists here. Okay, now we have a dilemma. A human can't possibly generate this, but we have shaken baby. These babies do have subdurals. And what's up with that, and I'll explain this in a second. Yet another study was done in Bethesda by Bandak. He's a Ph.D. biomechanician. He said, my God, I'm looking at this claim, and as an expert, reviewed the peer-reviewed literature, put it together as a meta-analysis, and said, dear people, if you got anywhere near 11,000 radians per second squared, guess what would happen? Decapitation, right? Okay. Now think of a whiplash. You've done it with your towel, you know, on your spouse or friend. That acceleration at the end is what we're talking about here. So you're holding a baby, and how do you hold a little baby? Yes, because the neck does not have its myelination yet, right? So it doesn't have neck authority, so you have to hold it. So now, imagine shaking a baby. You're holding it by the trunk, presumably, and the head is this way or that way, or whichever way it is. And if you have any mechanical aptitude, you're trying to figure, okay, how am I going to do this? And this head is going to be going back and forth. It's not going to be harmonic. There's going to be a lot of noise in this, so you're going to get some really strange whiplashing for sure, but you're not going to get anywhere near 11,000. I invite you to do an experiment at home. Get the equivalent in soda bottles, the weight of a baby, and measure this, which is going to be about 18 inches, and get a friend to time you, and do this with the load as fast as you can, and you can therefore estimate your average velocity, right? And you can imagine the translation to the acceleration, which provokes me to tell you about a woman who is 54 years old that I'm in touch with,